At 8:42 p.m. on January 31, 2026, an 11-year-old girl stood in front of law enforcement and said one sentence. "I'm not going back." No panic. No raised voice. Just refusal. Officers would later say it wasn't what she said that stood out. It was how certain she was. Because children hesitate. They look for reassurance. They change their minds. She didn't. And that certainty would become the first crack in a system of control that had been operating for nearly a year. In Northern California, just outside Sacramento, an 11-year-old girl had been living with her aunt, Priscilla Mastaz, and her partner, Anthony Machuca. To neighbors, nothing appeared unusual. No visible disturbances. No obvious signs of distress. But when the case surfaced in early 2026, it shocked the community, not because it was sudden, but because of how long it had allegedly gone unnoticed. And more importantly, how it was finally exposed. The timeline begins months earlier. Summer of 2024. The girl moves into the home. A new living arrangement. A new routine. At least, that's how it appeared on paper. But investigators would later determine that what developed inside that home wasn't a normal adjustment period. It was a structured environment built around control. And control leaves patterns. By January 2025, according to prosecutors, that control had escalated into a consistent cycle. Not chaotic. Not unpredictable. Structured. Repeated. Measured. That distinction mattered. Because it meant the behavior wasn't impulsive. It was sustained. Deliberate. One of the earliest indicators investigators focused on wasn't physical. It was environmental. Where the child slept. Not in a bedroom. Not in shared family space. But in the garage. Unfinished. Uninsulated. Separate. At first glance, that detail could be dismissed as unusual parenting. Temporary discipline. But when placed into a longer timeline, it became something else. A pattern of isolation. And isolation is a common mechanism in coercive control environments. Food access was another variable. Not entirely removed. But inconsistent. Conditional. Investigators noted that irregular access to basic needs can function as behavioral conditioning. It creates dependency. Compliance. And over time, silence. There were also reports of forced physical activity. Not framed as exercise, but as punishment. Or control. And again, it wasn't random. It followed structure. Commands. Expectations. Consequences. The system was predictable. Which, paradoxically, makes it more effective. Because the victim learns the rules. And adapts to survive within them. But the most critical detail, the one that would later collapse everything, was already present during this period. Quietly. In the background. Inside the home. Cameras. At first, surveillance systems aren't unusual. Many households use them. Security. Monitoring. Peace of mind. But investigators would later determine that these cameras weren't just passive. They were constant. Recording daily activity. Movement. Behavior. Everything. And at the time, that likely reinforced control. Because when someone believes they are always being watched, they regulate themselves. They comply. They stay quiet. But that same system would eventually become evidence. And that's where the flaw existed. Not in the intent, but in the oversight. Because control systems that rely on documentation also create records. And records can be reviewed. Throughout 2025, the pattern continued. According to charges later filed, the child was subjected to repeated physical discipline. Allegations included striking, restraining, and threats. But what stood out to investigators wasn't just the acts themselves. It was the consistency. The repetition. No escalation to chaos. No sudden spikes. Just a controlled environment where behavior was enforced. Daily. And that created a question. If the system was so controlled, what caused it to break? The answer begins with something small. A shift in compliance. Because in environments like this, control depends on predictability. The moment that predictability changes, the system weakens. January 31st, 2026. The girl refuses to return home. Not temporarily. Not emotionally. Firmly. That decision disrupted the entire structure. Because the system only worked within the home. Outside of it, the control disappeared. Law enforcement responded. Initial contact was routine. Until it wasn't. Because her statements introduced allegations of ongoing abuse. And those statements were specific. Consistent. Detailed. That matters in early investigative stages. Because consistency increases credibility. Officers documented her account. Then initiated contact with the residents. This is where behavioral analysis becomes important. Initial interactions with suspects often reveal subtle indicators. Tone. Timing. Over-explanation. Minimization. Investigators noted inconsistencies. Not overt contradictions. But slight misalignments in how events were described. And in isolation, those details might not stand out. But within context, they matter. A search warrant was obtained. The home was examined. Room by room. Nothing immediately obvious in primary living spaces. Clean. Organized. Structured. Which aligned with the idea of a controlled environment. Then investigators moved to the garage. And the context shifted. Because now, the physical environment matched the child's description. Not fully equipped for habitation. No adequate heating. No standard bedding. This wasn't a temporary setup. It showed signs of repeated use. But the most significant discovery wasn't the garage. It was the surveillance system. Because now, investigators had something beyond testimony. They had recorded behavior. This is where the case transitions from allegation to evidence. Surveillance footage provides timeline verification, behavioral confirmation, pattern documentation, and unlike witness statements, it doesn't rely on memory. When investigators reviewed the footage, they weren't looking for isolated incidents. They were looking for patterns, repetition, consistency with the reported timeline. And that's exactly what they found. Moments that aligned with the victim's statements. Movement patterns. Interactions. Environmental conditions. All captured. All time-stamped. And this is where the earlier detail becomes critical. The same system that likely reinforced compliance created a record of behavior. And once that record existed outside the control of the suspects, it became evidence. Anthony Machuca was arrested the same day. January 31st. Immediate custody. That decision suggests investigators believed there was sufficient probable cause based on initial findings. Priscilla Mestaz was not arrested immediately. Not due to lack of evidence, but due to medical considerations. She was pregnant. That delay is important, because it shows that the investigation was procedural, not reactive. During this period, additional children were identified in the home. A newborn. A younger child. Both removed and placed into protective custody. This aligns with standard child protection protocols when environmental risk is confirmed. Over the next several weeks, investigators expanded the case. This phase is critical in any true crime documentary analysis, because this is where isolated evidence becomes a structured case. They reconstructed the timeline, cross-referenced statements, reviewed all available surveillance footage, documented each instance that supported the charges. And the number of charges, 27 in total, reflects that structure. Each count tied to a specific act, a specific moment, a specific piece of evidence. This is not incidental. It indicates a case built on repeated behavior, not a single event. March 12, 2026. Priscilla Mestaz is arrested. Timing aligns with post-birth recovery. At this point, both suspects are in custody. Now the case transitions into legal framing. Prosecutors begin organizing the evidence into a narrative. Not just what happened, but how to prove it. The prosecution theory centers on sustained abuse within a controlled environment, supported by victim statements, environmental evidence, and most importantly, surveillance footage. The defense, in cases like this, often challenges interpretation, context, intent. They may argue discipline versus abuse, or question the completeness of the footage. But this is where forensic evidence matters. Because digital recordings establish sequence. They remove ambiguity. They show timing, behavior, interaction, without reliance on interpretation alone. This case does not rely on a single piece of evidence. It relies on convergence, multiple sources aligning. And that brings us back to the key failure. The overlooked detail. The behavioral crack. The cameras. From a control perspective, surveillance creates authority. It reinforces oversight. It limits deviation. But from an investigative perspective, it creates documentation. And documentation is permanent. The system inside that home relied on consistency, routine, predictability. But it also relied on privacy. On the assumption that what happened inside would stay inside. The cameras violated that assumption. Not intentionally, but structurally. Because once law enforcement accessed that footage, the control system no longer belonged to the suspects. It became evidence. This is where the case shifted. Not when the allegations were made. Not even when the search occurred. But when the footage was reviewed. Because at that point, the narrative was no longer contested. It was observed. From a criminal psychology perspective, this reflects a common pattern. Control-based environments often overextend. They implement systems to reinforce authority. But those same systems can introduce risk. In this case, the need to monitor behavior created a record of it. Now consider the refusal. The moment the girl said, "I'm not going back," that decision removed her from the controlled environment. Which meant the system could no longer function. Without compliance, control fails. And once the system failed, the evidence remained. The psychological component here is subtle but significant. There is no indication of impulsive behavior. No sudden loss of control. Instead, this appears to be a sustained pattern of structured authority, which suggests a mindset focused on regulation, on maintaining order, on enforcing behavior over time. But systems like that depend on one critical factor: silence. And silence ended on January 31st. As the case moves through the courtroom process, the outcome will depend on how the evidence is presented, how the timeline is constructed, how the jury interprets the convergence of testimony and digital documentation. Because in modern investigations, digital footprint plays an increasing role. Surveillance, metadata, time-stamped behavior. These elements create objective anchors. And in this case, those anchors appear central. The broader question becomes, would the case have unfolded the same way without the footage? Because testimony alone introduces doubt. Memory can be challenged. Statements can be questioned. But recorded behavior is harder to dispute. Which brings the case back to a single point. Not the most obvious one. Not the most visible. but the most consequential. The decision to document everything. That detail didn't seem significant at the time. It likely felt like control. Like oversight. Like reinforcement. But in reality, it created a record that could not be controlled. And once that record was seen by investigators, everything changed. If you were reviewing that case file, would the surveillance footage alone be enough to establish intent? Or would you still need to rely on interpretation of behavior within context?